Good day everyone. This video is all about the plant's life cycle and the alternation of generation. So I'm going to explain the processes involved within the plant's reproduction cycle, as well as the structure and process of the sporophyte and gametophyte of a plant. So we first need to understand the alternation of generation. So since we are going to talk about the plant's life cycle, we should know that alternation of generation is what makes the cycle possible. So it is a very crucial part. So to start with, what do we mean by this alternation of generation? So alternation of generation is a type of life cycle found in all plants. So this process involves a multicellular diploid generation called sporophyte and a multicellular haploid generation called gametophyte. So as we know, diploid means having two sets of chromosomes in your cells and is indicated as 2N, while the haploid means having only one set of chromosomes in your cells and is indicated as N. Okay, now all plants go through two stages of generations, and this it goes through two stages in their life cycle, and this is called the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. So here we have the cycle of alternation of generation. So we'll start at the sporophyte generation. So most plants have a dominant sporophyte generation. So think about a fern plant, for example, which represents the sporophyte generation. And that sporophyte generation is diploid. So meaning to say that it has two sets or two copies of chromosomes. Now, in this sporophyte generation, there are special structures wherein meiosis takes place. And when meiosis takes place, of course, the diploid cell divides to produce haploid spores. So take note, meiosis is where one cell divides to produce with half the number of chromosomes, which now makes a diploid cell into a haploid. Now, these haploid spores will again divide by the process of mitosis, wherein one cell divides and produces two genetically identical daughter cells. And that results now in the gametophyte generation. So remember that the gametophyte generation is of course haploid. Now this haploid gametophyte produces gametes, the sperms and egg. So if you think about pollen represents the male gametophyte. So the sperm and the egg are both haploid. So now during fertilization, the sperm will fertilize the egg and then we get a diploid zygote. So this diploid zygote will then divide by the process of mitosis and we get a sporophyte generation. Hence, that is why it is called alternation of generation. It is a cycle. So the sporophyte, as the name suggests, it produces spores, which develops into a gametophyte. Then the gametophyte produces sperm cells and egg cells. Then the sperm fertilizes the egg, and the fertilized eggs develops into a sporophyte. Now, to have a more detailed explanation, let's take a look at this flowering plant. So we'll talk about the angiosperm's life cycle. So a very significant part of a flower is the filament and the anther, which together makes the stamen. Now the stamen is the male structure of the flowering plant, and it is where the pollens are produced. Now in the middle part is the female organs of a flower, which is called the pistil, and is comprised of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So in the stamen, inside the anther contains diploid cells, and the cells inside the anther is called microsporophytes. The first and second stage says that in the stamen, diploid microsporophytes undergo meiosis to produce 4 haploid microspores. So inside the anther, through meiosis, the microsporophytes produces 4 haploid microspores. Now, if we recall the alternation of generation, spores will become the gametophyte generation. So these microspores will grow through the process of mitosis to form pollen grains. So as indicated, each undergoes mitosis to produce a pollen grain with two haploid nuclei. So remember that the pollen grain is the male gametophyte of a plant. So inside the pollen, there are two distinct cells, namely the tube cell and the generative cell. The tube cell or the tube nucleus directs the growth of a pollen tube, while the generative cell generates to produce sperm cells. And all that process happens in the stamen. Now, let's take a look at what happens inside the female organs of a flowering plant, so in the pistil. So, in the ovary, diploid megasporophytes undergo meiosis to produce 4 haploid megaspores, but only one survives. Now, how does this happen? So, in an ovule, inside the ovary again, there is a diploid cell called megasporophytes. Now, the megasporophytes is going to give rise to the megaspores. So this diploid cell undergoes meiosis, and then what will happen? It will form or produce 4 haploid megaspores. But most of the time, actually, only one spores or only one megaspores survives, and the other spores disintegrates. So, as stated, the surviving megaspore divides mitotically 3 times to produce 8 haploid nuclei. So the one megaspore which will become the gametophyte, it will divide. It goes through 3 rounds of mitotic division, so 3 nuclear division. So our 1 nuclei becomes 2, and 2 becomes 4, and the 4 becomes 8. And then, after that, something very interesting happens. The cytoplasm divides, producing separate cells. So one of which becomes the egg. So the 2 of the nuclei becomes a polar nuclei, and the other nuclei are partitioned into separate cells. So one of the haploids nuclei will automatically become the egg. So now we have the pollen made inside the anther, and the eggs are ready inside the ovule. So what we need next is pollination, wherein we have to get the pollen from an anther to a stigma. So it's quite interesting because as we know that flowers or plants doesn't move, so how can fertilization takes place, right? So this happens through biotic vectors, or should I say pollinators, which are living things that move pollen. For example, the bees. So that is the significance now of the other parts of the flower or the plant. For example, the petals, the nectar, the fragrance is mainly to attract pollinators. So when the pollen now is attached to the stigma of the pistil through biotic vectors, double fertilization takes place when the 2 sperm cells of a pollen grain enter the embryo sac. So the tube cell creates a tube down through the style to the ovule, and the generative cell produces 2 sperms that travel down the tube. So one sperm cell fertilizes the egg, producing a diploid zygote, and the other sperm cell fuses with the binucleate cell, or otherwise known as the endosperm mother cell, to form triploid endosperm. So after that, there are still process that's gonna happen and take place, but I believe that's beyond the previous discussion. So that would be all for this discussion and this video.